This video is sponsored by War Thunder. War Thunder is a realistic, free-to-play military vehicle combat game. It's available on PC, PS5, Xbox Series X, and previous generations of consoles as well. No need to purchase anything, just download and play. In this game, there are more than 2,000 historically accurate tanks, helicopters, ships, and other vehicles spanning the entire 20th century. They're all carefully built and incredibly detailed, operating in a realistic physics engine. It's an immersive gaming experience with real historical campaigns. Even the sound is excellent. And look, you could just jump in for a quick arcade game. That's what I do. I am a busy dude. I don't have tons of time to get into depth. I just want to relax for a few moments in a busy day. But you can also play realistic and go for the more challenging tactical stuff. And for your hardcore folks, there's also simulator if you just enjoy getting your ass kicked. Well, that's for you. Right now, War Thunder is inviting all of you guys to join its 50 million worldwide players on the battlefield for free using the link below. And those that do jump into the game using my link, War Thunder is going to give you a free premium tank, aircraft, or ship, plus 3 days of premium play for free. Very cool deal. Thank you, War Thunder. And now, today's video. According to the blue and white patches stitched to the fly suits of the men who flew them, when you're out of F-8s, you're out of fighters. Powerful, fast, and remarkably agile, F-8 Crusaders were among the most advanced and lethal fighters in existence between the late 50s and the early 70s. Thanks largely to their stubby noses and gaping engine inlets, F-8s weren't as sleek as some of their early jet-age counterparts, but they were chock full of advanced avionics and revolutionary design features. Built by the Vought Corporation to replace the Navy and Marine Corps' flying F-7U Cutlasses, by the time the F-8s first took to the skies, a major sea change had taken place in the fighter arena. Whereas World War II and Korean War era fighters had relied almost exclusively on heavy machine guns and cannons to down their opponents, by the mid-1950s, cutting-edge air-to-air missiles were poised to dominate dogfights of the future. As such, guns were largely seen as little more than quaint relics of a bygone age. Prevailing Navy doctrine favored missiles over guns, and in some instances, limited air combat in Korea had shown guns and cannons to be glaringly deficient, except when adversarial aircraft were in relatively close proximity to one another. On the other hand, traditionalists rightly claimed that in up-close knife fights, there was just no substitute for the lethality and reliability of good old-fashioned guns. In addition, missile, radar, and guidance technologies still had a really long way to go. Hence, in addition to a wide array of guided missiles and unguided bombs, Crusaders would be equipped with 4 20mm cannons, earning them the title the last of the gunfighters. In the early fall of 1952, the Navy sought design proposals for a new aircraft that would be part interceptor and part superiority fighter. With a stable top speed of Mach 1.2, about 920 miles per hour, a phenomenal climb rate approaching 26,000 feet per minute, and the ability to take off and land at just 100 miles per hour, the Navy's specifications were remarkably ambitious. At least in the early going, competition from McDonnell's F-8 Demon was pretty stiff. The Demon would ultimately become the iconic F-4 Phantom, but at the time it lagged behind Vaught's design in a number of key areas. Meanwhile, Grumman threw its F-11 Tiger into the mix, and North American adapted its F-100 Super Sabre for carrier use and rechristened it the Super Fury. Led by renowned aircraft designer John Russell Clark, the Vought team got to work creating the first Crusader prototype. This was designated the V-383. In a huge divergence from traditional fighter design, the odd-looking aircraft featured a one-piece low-aspect ratio wing mounted to the top of its fuselage. In addition, the leading edge of the variable incidence wing could pivot upward approximately 7 degrees to create additional lift and reduce stall speed during carrier takeoff and landings. This innovation alone helped the Crusaders development team win the coveted Collier Trophy in 1956. Likewise, the groundbreaking new wing significantly improved performance at various speeds and altitudes that would allow Crusaders to perform well in fighter, interceptor, and reconnaissance roles. Whenever possible, Vought engineers incorporated titanium wing and airframe components to increase strength and minimize weight, and thanks to their single Pratt & Whitney axial flow J57 turbojet engines, Crusaders had particularly high power-to-weight ratios. J57s were the first American jet engines to produce 10,000 pounds of dry thrust, while with their afterburners lit, power output jumped by nearly 60%. After a lengthy evaluation process that ended in May of 1953, the Navy declared Vaught's design to be the winner. The following month, the company received an order for 3 prototypes, the first of which was delivered in January of 1955. Then, in late March of that year, Vaught's chief experimental test pilot, John Conrad, eased the aircraft into the sky, and less than an hour into its maiden flight, man and machine pushed their way past the sound barrier. Development proceeded smoothly, and the second prototype made its first catapult-assisted launch from the USS Forrestal in early April of 1956. From there, Vaught's Crusader began making history almost immediately. In late August of 1956, Commander Robert W. Windsor pushed his F-8 to 1,016 miles per hour over a 9.3-mile closed course, smashing the previous record set by an F-100 by more than 100 miles per hour. Britain's Fairy Delta still held the absolute world record of 1,132 miles per hour, but the Crusader would go on to become the first operational jet capable of exceeding 1,000 miles per hour in level flight. Then in mid-July of 1957, future astronaut John Glenn Jr. flew an F-8 on a record-breaking transcontinental flight between Los Alamitos, California and Bennett Field in New York. Including refuelings, Glenn and his Crusader covered the 2,807 miles in just over 3 hours and 20 minutes. Just longer than 54 feet and measuring 35.5 feet from wingtip to wingtip, when fully loaded with fuel and weapons, Crusaders tipped the scales at nearly 35,000 pounds. By comparison, F-4 Phantoms had maximum takeoff weights exceeding 60,000 pounds. Thanks to the abundant thrust provided by their J57 engines, production Crusaders were even faster than the performance parameters set out by the Navy. With maximum speeds approaching Mach 1.5, Crusaders were capable of climbing past 59,000 feet in less than 7 minutes, and combat range was a respectable 450 miles. In addition to 4 20mm cannons, Crusader armament included up to 4 AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles, unguided rockets, and nearly 5,000 pounds of bombs that could be carried on external hardpoints on the wings and fuselage. Ironically, however, despite their well-known status as gunfighters, many pilots regarded their cannons as unreliable and underpowered, and in addition, erratic high-G maneuvers often caused jams, which rendered them entirely useless. The first operational units received their new Crusaders on board USS Franklin D. Roosevelt in April of 1957. However, carrier trials were far hairier than expected, and a number of crashes resulted in destroyed aircraft and pilot fatalities, many of which were attributable to high landing speeds and quirky handling characteristics. The first fleet air arm to fly Crusaders operationally was Florida-based VF-32, which deployed to the Mediterranean on board the USS Saratoga in late 1957. Just a few months later, Pacific Fleet units, both in San Diego and Northern California, began getting their new birds as well. But though most pilots had undergone both day and night fighter training, early Crusaders were generally restricted to flying during daylight hours and in relatively good weather. This allowed pilots to familiarize themselves with high-performance machines without having to worry about poor visibility and weather-related issues, both of which could be addressed later on. F-8s first saw action during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, when the world teetered on the edge of nuclear annihilation. During the tense standoff to mildly between the United States and the Soviet Union, unarmed RF-8A reconnaissance variants cut their teeth on high-speed, low-altitude photography runs over Cuba and the Gulf of Mexico. Each day, 2 flights of RF-8As departed from Key West. Then, with their missions complete, they landed in Jacksonville, where the film they'd taken was unloaded and developed before being sent off for analysis at the Pentagon. All told, the RF-8As flew for a month and a half and captured nearly 170,000 images, many of which clearly showed Soviet missile sites in Cuba just 90 miles off the Florida Keys. Fortunately, as that situation de-escalated, RF-8A crews were also tasked with monitoring the Soviet withdrawal. Later, the pilots who flew the all-important missions were awarded either Distinguished Flying Crosses or the prestigious US Navy Unit Commendation. Next, Crusaders proved their worth in the skies over Vietnam, but in this conflict, many would trade in their cameras for guns missiles and bombs. At the time, Crusaders were the best dogfighters in the Navy's inventory, but they'd have their work cut out for them flying against the small and agile MiGs that the Soviets had supplied to their North Vietnamese comrades. In their first engagement, Crusaders from USS Hancock engaged MiG-17s from the North Vietnamese Air Force in early April of 1965. Though the battle was largely a stalemate, the gun camera of the MiG-17 flown by Lieutenant Pham Ngoc clearly showed that a cannon burst had set the F-8 flown by Lieutenant Commander Spence Thomas ablaze. Thomas managed to limp his damaged machine back to the airbase at Da Nang, but though American pilots and their aircraft hadn't been clear victors on that day, as aerial engagements intensified, they'd set the standard by which all other Navy fighters would be judged. Another notable engagement took place between North Vietnamese MiG-21s and Navy Crusaders on the 1st of August 1968. During the dogfight, North Vietnamese ace Nguyen Hong Ni fired two R-3S air-to-air missiles at a pair of F-8s, the second of which hit and downed its target. Following a brief dogfight with the remaining F-8, two more Crusaders came to the rescue, and in the end, Nguyen Hong Ni's MiG was hit by a Sidewinder, though he fortunately ejected and survived. But despite being capable dogfighters, some Navy and Marine Corps Crusaders were relegated to bomb truck duty. Generally, Marine Crusaders operated from land bases and only flew in the south in support of ground troops, while Navy F-8s operated from Essex-class carriers and handled long-range missions against refineries, airfields, and rail depots in the north. By war's end, F-8s had officially downed 19 enemy MiGs while losing only 3 of their own. Of the F-8s that were lost, all were reportedly downed by cannon fire from older and less advanced MiG-17s. On the other hand, despite the last gunfighter moniker, only 4 of the F-8's 19 confirmed kills were achieved with cannons, while the rest were credited to AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. During the war, 170 Crusaders were lost to all causes, most of which were due to ground fire and accidents. Over multiple decades, Vought created a number of F-8 variants that benefited from increasingly powerful engines, upgraded radar, and more advanced weapons and avionics. Of these, many were RF-8G reconnaissance variants that served well into the 1980s with naval reserve units. More than 40 F-8E air superiority fighters were built for the French Navy, and in the United States, a number of early A variants went out with prodigious bangs after being converted into remotely controlled target drones. But in an ironic twist of fate, the most potent Crusader of all may have been the one that never entered service, the XF-8U-3 Crusader 3. Dubbed the Super Crusader when the first prototype made its maiden flight in the summer of 1958, it became immediately apparent that it was not only noticeably bigger than the Crusader 1, but also faster and more maneuverable. But though the experimental Crusader 3 looked like a larger version of the Crusader 1, underneath its thin aluminium skin, it was almost an entirely different craft. Powered by an upgraded J75P5A producing 16,500 pounds of dry thrust and nearly 30,000 pounds with the afterburner engaged, the Super Crusader reported a top speed of 1,835 miles per hour, and some engineers felt that with a little tweaking, it could top 2,000 miles per hour. In addition to higher climb rate, top speed, and service ceiling, Super Crusaders would have longer ranges, more advanced avionics, and better all-weather capability than nearly anything else the Navy had. Likewise, Super Crusaders would have been far less expensive to manufacture and maintain, and some estimates suggested that they'd have used 40% less fuel with a comparatively equipped F-4 Phantom. But perhaps most tellingly, the Crusader 3 regularly defeated early model Phantoms in mock dogfights. In fact, in some circles, the Super Crusader is still referred to as one of the best planes that the Navy ever cancelled. Despite impressive performance, Crusaders weren't the easiest airplanes to fly. By the time the last F-8 had been retired, more than 1,000 of the 1,290 built had been involved in what the Navy referred to as mishaps. Few of these incidents resulted in death or destroyed aircraft, but especially for inexperienced pilots, Crusaders were particularly difficult to control during takeoff and landings. After steam catapult-assisted carrier launches, earlier variants had a tendency to swap ends. In other words, due to a lack of yaw stability, the aircraft's tail often swung around toward the nose. In conjunction with the Crusader's notoriously poor low-speed response, this harrowing phenomena often resulted in last-minute ejections and aircraft nosediving into the sea below the carrier's bow. Thankfully, the stability issue was solved by the addition of 2 ventral fins on the underside of the fuselage just forward of the exhaust nozzle. High-sink rates often made touchdowns bone-jarring affairs as well, and the pilot's struggles weren't necessarily over just because they were back on deck. In fact, many naval aviators complained about the position of the forward castering landing gear, which protruded from the fuselage well aft of the cockpit. The resulting overhang made F-8s awkward to maneuver in tight quarters. When guided by deck crews, pilots often found themselves and the tips of their aircraft suspended in space over the ocean below, despite the fact that the nose strut was safely on the deck behind them. In addition, carriers often had to steam at full speed away from their incoming aircraft to lower their relative speeds while landing. Worse yet, before the introduction of nuclear-powered carriers, flight decks were often awash in thick black smoke from the oil-burning engines, which could severely limit visibility and make already tense landings even more tense. In instances like these, pilots often had to rely exclusively on instructions from landing signal officers. But though they were handfuls even for experienced pilots, F-8s were equally dangerous to deck crews. Due to their powerful engines and deck-level intakes, F-8s were capable of ingesting foreign matter and even deck personnel who carelessly wandered into the danger zone, hence why they were often referred to as gators and ensign eliminators. To reduce their footprint both above and below deck, Crusaders were equipped with folding wingtips. On at least one occasion, a Crusader took off with its wingtips in the up position. Later, back on deck safely, the pilot said he'd been alarmed to discover that his aircraft was particularly sluggish and unresponsive just after getting airborne. Then, peering out of the cockpit, he immediately realized why. Luckily, the decreased lift and lack of maneuverability were overcome by added power when the pilot prudently lit the engine's afterburner. Just a few minutes later, he landed without incidents. In the end, the Crusader's inherent flaws, less than favorable flight conditions, and stupid mistakes all contributed to its high accident rate. All told, more than 1,200 Crusaders were manufactured, the last of which was delivered to Naval Air Station Miramar in early September of 1964. In an era of great advances, huge military budgets, and premature obsolescence, Crusaders were the first post-Korean War aircraft to have a relatively long tenures with the Navy. Several modified F-8s were used by NASA in the early 1970s to test digital avionics and advanced wing designs, while most of them were officially retired in the mid-1970s. The last operational F-8 was a reconnaissance variant that ultimately ended up on display at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Crusaders also served with the Philippine Air Force and French Navy well into the 1990s, though by then in the United States they'd long since been replaced by F-14 Tomcats and F-18 Hornets. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring today's video. Remember to follow the link in the description below to start playing their free vehicle combat game with 3 free days of premium play and a free premium vehicle as well. Go check it out, and thank you for watching.